Welcome to a time of contemplative prayer from Malvern Link with Cowleigh on this Holy Tuesday. I hope you're having a good week so far as we journey through Holy Week, and a warm welcome back to all of those who've been journeying with us through our Palm Sunday services. And this is the first of our services for Holy Week. We have this tonight, and then tomorrow night at 7:30 we have Stations of the Cross. At 7:30 on Thursday night, we'll be celebrating the Eucharist of the Last Supper. On Good Friday at 12 noon, we'll be having an hour of prayers before the cross. And then at 7:30 on Good Friday evening, we'll also be having a drama which we've specially commissioned for this week. On 7:30 on Holy Saturday, we'll be celebrating a service of the light before we all gather together at 9:45 on Easter Day to celebrate the Easter Day service, the Eucharist, and the first Eucharist of Easter. As I said on Sunday, this is an opportunity for us to journey with Christ, and I hope that all of the things that we've put together for this week will give you that opportunity. Some of you will have a lot of experience of contemplative prayer. Others of you will have read some things about it. Others of you will have had no experience of it at all. We tend to think of prayer in the way of it being intercessory prayer, the prayers that we hear in the Eucharist. On a Sunday morning, we'll hear people coming up, standing at the front of the church and praying for people in the congregation, for people's families, for things in our particular community, culture, society, and for the world. And what we're doing in those prayers is we're asking God for something. We're asking for an intercession. So we are interceding on behalf of those people or those particular things. Contemplative prayer is different. And contemplative prayer, we tend to think of it being a solo activity, something that is not about joining together with others. But one of the earliest ways of thinking about prayer, one of the earliest ways of thinking about God, which comes from this book, which I'm going to grab now, which is St. Augustine's City of God. Now, for those of you who've just had a small heart attack and thought, he's not going to suggest that we start reading this in Holy Week, I'm not suggesting you start reading this in Holy Week, although it is a quite extraordinary book. One of the ways in which Augustine thinks about prayer and contemplation is with the spokes of a wheel. If you imagine the centre of the wheel being God, and that we start our journey towards God on the edge, at the rim of the wheel, and then we journey slowly down the spoke towards the centre point of the wheel. As we begin the journey, we are the furthest point away from every single other person on that journey at the edge of the wheel. But the closer we get to the centre, the closer we are, in fact, to others in community. And so whilst we think of contemplative prayer being a solo endeavour, it is in fact something that gathers us closer to Christ. So there are two ways of experiencing contemplative prayer. One way is for us to think about stillness being a key part of the Christian tradition, and we would think about that in terms of meditation, in terms of silent contemplation. The other aspect of contemplative prayer is about awareness, is about being, about noticing what's going on. And we think of that much more in the terms of the tradition of mindfulness. Our temptation always, when we are engaged in prayer, is to think in words and to talk. And one of the things that we are drawn to in contemplation is silence. One of the reasons why people struggle with contemplative prayer is that they simply haven't had enough of an experience of silence. In the same way But people who aren't very good at listening, one of the reasons why they're not very good at listening is because they've never been listened to. And when I mean listened to, I don't just mean heard, I mean listened to at a very deep and profound level. When you've had that experience yourself, it's much easier to offer that to others. And so when we want to experience contemplation, we need to practice silence. Silence is really hard for a lot of us. We don't live in a quiet world. We come in, put on the radio, put on music, put on podcasts, we talk, we watch television. But the sense of silence that we're talking about is a silence that rests, not an absence of noise, but something much deeper. Augustine talks about the silence of the heart, but he also talks about us being gathered home, that we will journey home to the land of where God is. There's a tendency for us to think that we are going to journey and go somewhere physically to find God. But the first mistake is to think that God is somewhere outside ourselves, as opposed to God being in us. So God and contemplation is not about the acquiring of those things. We don't acquire contemplation. We don't acquire silence or stillness. And we don't acquire God. What we do is realise and discover contemplation and silence and God. So how do we do that? One of the ways of starting is to recognise that this is a practice. It's not a technique, it's a practice. For those of you who are keen gardeners and you talk about that you're growing things in your garden, you of course are not growing anything. You are practicing growing things, and you have the practice of gardening, the practice of all the things that go into growing things. But you don't grow anything yourself. Similarly, sailing a ship is the practice of particular skills, of particular things that will lead you to be able to sail a ship. And contemplation is a practice in itself. So I'm interested in the idea of contemplative practice. Practice is something that you do constantly, over and over again. And it's not about doing something to achieve a particular result. It's about having an experience and then practicing again and again and again. So our first task is to try and let go of the idea of doing things in order to acquire particular skills or techniques. In one sense, the technique is incredibly simple, if you want it to be a technique at all. The technique is, of course, of stopping, being still, and being. This, however, is one of the hardest things to do, and our practice will be something that we will engage in over and over again. So, on this Holy Tuesday, I want you to experience something of what contemplative prayer can offer. So we're going to do a few exercises, a few spiritual exercises, if you will. We're going to take some time to reflect and to be. And then we're going to think about how we might build this into a habit or routine. So the first thing to do is to experience silence and stillness, even if it is for a moment. So we're going to have 30 seconds of silence and stillness. If it helps you to close your eyes, then do. But what I want you to do and try at home is that when you think the 30 seconds is up, to either make a mental note for yourself, open your eyes, and then I'll tell you when the 30 seconds is up. Some of you will find that goes very quickly. Some of you will be surprised when the 30 seconds is announced. Others of you will find that it was all too short. So let's just try. 30 seconds, and when you think it's up, then open your eyes. Seconds. Now, what people tend to do when they have this experience is some people count because they want to get it right. They want to have the experience of proving that they are somehow able to count to 30 in an even-handed way and find themselves on the other side successfully having completed the task. For other people, you would have closed your eyes and the announcement that 30 seconds was up would have come a moment later. For other people, that 30 seconds would have felt like an eternity. We all have different reactions because we all live at a different speed. Some of us live at a very fast speed inside our bodies, others of us at a slower speed. But stillness is something very different. Stillness is not the absence of movement. There's actually only no movement in the human body once you die. But if you're alive, there is always movement. And stillness is, as a famous man once said, a movement choice. Because what stillness is a decision to be still. It's actually quite hard to be still by accident. Most of us will shift and move and twitch and just get ourselves comfortable. But the idea of being still can be very challenging for us. Stillness and silence go together. It's not that you can't be contemplative walking, you can. It's just slightly harder sometimes. And the stillness adds an extra layer of complexity, but also depth. So what do we do in order to help ourselves when we're being still? Well, we find a place and a position to be still in. You'll find loads of guides on the internet and loads of books that will show you how to meditate and will say that you need to adopt a particular position. People often think that you need to sit up when you meditate, and for a lot of people that's true. And partly the reason why you're instructed to do that is because you're trying to teach your body that you can be alert and awake while also being still and silent. A lot of us, the only time that we're silent and still is when we're asleep. So what about, for us, a way of being still and silent that allows us to be alert? One of the reasons why you're not encouraged to lie down a lot of the time is because you probably will end up associating that with sleep. But for some of us, me included, sitting actually can be incredibly painful after a period of time. And so actually, whenever I meditate, whenever I do contemplative prayer, actually lie on the ground. I actually find that significantly more comfortable and much easier to find a comfortable position to be in. And trying to find that comfortable position which will allow you to let go, that's the key thing. So if that's sitting on a sofa, if that's sitting in a chair in your garden, if that's lying on the floor, frankly, if that's lying in bed, I really don't care. I think whatever works for you. But it's finding somewhere where you can be for a period of time. A lot of people, when they begin contemplative practice, set themselves goals that they want to do so many minutes. They want to get to a particular point. And actually, I think that's a bad idea. It's not worth managing to chalk up 19 minutes a day if those 19 minutes are not filled with a depth. And so even 30 seconds, even 2 minutes is good and great because it's practice. So if you practice little and often, that's absolutely fine. If you're one of those people that is able to find stillness and silence for a longer period of time, great. Neither is better. What we're searching for in contemplation is not to be searching for something in contemplation. There is a danger in which we think that the journey is out and beyond ourselves, but actually God is to be found in us. Now, that is not to say that you are God, but it's that in God you find your being. St. Paul recognised this. It is not I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And he was constantly pushing at the doorway of these particular ideas. The idea of where Christ resides, where God is. We have a tendency always to think of God being outside of ourselves. But if we think about the landscape of God, or the land in which God resides, the landscape in which God resides, the land where God is to be found, is the land of silence, the silent lands. And so when we find that silence, we are entering into that space. And the silence is not to be found external to ourselves. The silence is to be found in us. We're now going to do a second exercise, which is an exercise of noticing breath, simple awareness. And what I want to do in this exercise is for you not to be interested in breathing in, counting breaths, holding breaths, any of that kind of thing. You just breathe normally. The danger with an exercise like this is that the minute somebody talks about breath, your breath always changes. But do you know what? Don't worry about it. It happens to everybody, so it's a natural, normal thing. What I'm interested in here is the sensation of growing and shrinking. What's known in some circles as shape flow. This idea of just growing and shrinking. That when we breathe in, our bodies get bigger slightly, and when we breathe out, our bodies deflate and shrink a little. And so we're going to have a few moments where, if you can find yourself into a comfortable position and you can close your eyes, you can just experience this sense of the body growing and shrinking. As you feel the body grow and shrink, you'll initially experience this in your torso, in your ribs, maybe your back, your belly, your chest, as your body grows and shrinks with the lungs taking air in and expelling them. But if you bring your attention now to your arms, to your legs, to the whole of your body, can you experience the sensation of, as you breathe in, every single cell in your body growing and shrinking, and growing and shrinking? This sense of shape flow, where there is nothing else in the world apart from the growing and shrinking of your whole body, is a useful exercise. It's a good practice to experience. In one sense, it's profoundly centering, but also it just brings us into a space where we connect back to our bodies. This growing and shrinking is a useful metaphor for everything that goes on in our spiritual lives. We grow towards some things, we shrink from others. We think complex thoughts, ideas, dreams, ambitions and hopes. But actually, all the time, behind everything that we say and everything we do, we are a being that is just growing and shrinking. So that exercise is a way of us experiencing something very simple, but yet something that can occupy us. Most of us, when we have an experience of meditation, will have an experience of our minds being like the host of a party that's got completely out of control. We're slightly embarrassed by the behaviour of our guests because we think that we should somehow have managed to control this a lot better. And that's essentially what our minds feel like as well. We've got a sense in our heads that if we were better at this, we would be able to control all the different thoughts that are going on. We marvel at looking at people who seem so calm and reflective, who have this ability to meditate as if they have somehow sought out and found something incredibly precious. Of course, actually, what those people are really good at is beginning again and again and again and again. When we bring ourselves into stillness and silence, we are creating the best conditions that we can to be able to draw ourselves closer to God. The next stage, once we've found stillness and silence, is to let go and just note everything that goes on for us. So if you're sitting in silence and your mind wanders on to what you're going to have for dinner, and then you notice that your brain has wandered off into this whole journey of food and cooking and a whole bunch of other things, all you do is note it, just light noting, and bring yourself back. And then your mind will wander somewhere else, and you note it and bring it back. When I teach this in a class, we do an exercise where we throw a ball to each other. The minute you get a juggling ball out and say you're going to basically play a game of throw and catch, some people get incredibly anxious. It reminds them of being at school and terrible sport classes. But what's interesting is that the point of the exercise is to teach people that if the ball drops, it doesn't matter. It is just a game. You're not being judged on it. Your capacity to catch juggling balls or throw them accurately is not a skill that's incredibly important in the Christian life. What's interesting is that the minute you start playing the game, the first person who drops the ball apologises, gets agitated, quite anxious. Other people relax a bit because they weren't the first person to drop the ball, but then the anxiety goes up again because they're worried about that they may drop the ball. And if they drop the ball, then they beat themselves up and start having a go at themselves and say, oh, I've always been terrible at this, this is a stupid exercise. All the excuses you can imagine, we hear all the time. There is a discipline involved in the ball dropping, and all you say is, oh, that's it. Oh. Because the ball's dropped, you notice it, you pick it up, and you carry on. And in one sense, that is all that is happening in meditation. Our minds start talking, we notice it, and we start again. Our minds start talking, we notice it, and we start again. That really is the heart of contemplative meditation. It's just that, 17,000 times. And that's fine. Do we acquire anything during this process? The answer is no. Do we discover something in this process? The answer is yes. We discover that peace and silence of Christ within us. In his book, Into the Silent Land, Martin Laird talks about offering prayer classes for prisoners who are serving long sentences. The idea of teaching people to be able to have a profound experience whilst also being locked up. The idea of their prison cells becoming monastic cells instead. And one of the inmates described the fact that for years they had had this sense of pain in themselves, and that they had self-harmed as a way of dealing with that pain. That somehow the marking of their own skin was a way of moving that pain into a particular location. He described, after a month of practicing contemplation, seeing a small chink of somebody he could like. This acceptance and discovery is key to what happens in contemplative practice. I want to read you a tiny section on a poem by R.S. Thomas. But the silence in the mind is when we live best, within listening distance of the silence we call God. It is a presence then, whose margins are our margins, that call us out over our own fathoms. What to do but to draw a little nearer to such ubiquity by remaining still? Thomas encapsulates everything that I think about contemplative prayer in that line, within listening distance of the silence we call God. We know from the scriptures that God is not in the wind or the earthquake, but God is in the silence. And when we gather into silence, when we gather into that space, we start to experience who God might be for us. So I hope that for some time during this Holy Week, you will take a few moments to practice some stillness, some silence. Just see what the effect is on yourself, on those around you, but most importantly, on whether you can discover and glimpse something of God within. God simply does not know how to be absent. And so when we experience God as absent, it is us putting up barriers and walls and smoke screens. When we let go, we know that God is with us all the time. We'll finish with a prayer. Loving Father, as we journey with you in this most holy of weeks, may we be comforted by your voice. May we acknowledge the life force within each of us, that we may be still and silent, that we may glimpse something of you, hear your voice, and know your peace. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you for joining us, and again tomorrow evening at 7:30 we'll be having Stations of the Cross. For those of you who never experienced that before, it's an opportunity to journey the way of the cross, the way of sorrows, the Via Dolorosa with Christ as he goes to crucifixion. It's a profoundly moving and strong experience, and something which we always do during Holy Week, and I hope that you'll be able to join us there. God bless.